Hi everyone to our really quick snapshot view of Tourette syndrome. This is about key facts for you as school staff and ways that you can support your young people and pupils with Tourette syndrome and tics. My name is Kelsey Odgers and I'm a clinical psychologist from the Psychology in Schools team, which is part of the Norfolk and Suffolk NHS Foundation Trust. And I'll just let my colleague introduce herself.
Hi, my name's Anna, so I'm an assistant psychologist in the same team.
Brilliant, and we hope that you find this useful. Just want to firstly say thanks to Tourette's Action for some of their slide content. Tourette's Action is a brilliant charity and there's loads and loads of resources on their website, which we're going to signpost you to at the end. So just to get started, Tourette syndrome, what is it? So first and foremost, it's a neurological condition, and people with Tourette syndrome have something called tics. Now, tics may make you do sounds or movements that you really can't control or help doing. And that's really, really key message. They can't help them or control them. So what are tics? So as I've just said, they're movements or sounds that the person can't help doing. They can happen really, really quickly, and they can be quite repetitive, so happen kind of again and again and again. But they can also change over time. So they follow a kind of wax and waning pattern in terms of number, frequency and severity. And they can also increase when the child perhaps is more anxious, worried, stressed, but also excited. But they can also decrease when the child is more engaged in some activity which requires their attention. So it's just being mindful that they can kind of follow that waxing and waning pattern over time, and they can also change sort of day to day or activity to activity. But the key thing, as I've already said, is people who have Tourette syndrome are not doing their tics on purpose. Okay. So what are some of the sort of common tics that we might see? So what we know is there are two types of tics, so the movement ones and the vocal ones that I've already said, and they can be more simple or more complex. So some movement tics that we might see might be kind of small movements on the face, so sort of blinking or scrunching the nose, or sort of mouth movements, or they might be more complex movement tics, so things like arms and legs kicking out. With sound tics, it might be little noises such as throat clearing or sniffing, or indeed animal noises, or things that are more complex like words and sentences. We also just wanted to draw your attention to the swearing tic, because that's often the one that we see a lot on the TV, a lot in the media. But this is just another type of those vocal tics that I talked about. And approximately only 10% actually of young people with Tourette syndrome have it. But many people have tics like words, sentences or gestures that we know are at risk of offending others, like the swearing tics. So it's perhaps one of those more difficult tics that we might see in the classroom. And it's really hard to believe sometimes that a child who experiences these tics are not personally directing them at the teacher or other students, or they're not perhaps what the child actually believes themselves. So often when children have these type of tics that might be offensive to other people, they are just as upset and embarrassed as the other person, or probably more so. Okay, so it's really important to remember this as school staff, and remember that these tics, like others, have no intentional meaning behind them and need to be treated in the same way as other tics, which we're going to come to in a second.
Perfect, thanks. So just thinking a bit more about actually who has Tourette syndrome. So we know that Tourette syndrome can occur in anyone, and that actually it's around 1 in every 100 school children that has Tourette syndrome. So it's actually highly likely as a member of school staff that you will meet a child with Tourette syndrome. We know that it occurs most commonly in boys, but can also occur in girls. And we know that there are quite a few famous people that have it, so people in the public eye. So some people that you might be aware of as sort of the singer Lewis Capaldi or Billie Eilish. Footballers who have it like Tim Howard, the Everton goalie. And I guess it's really just sort of growing that understanding that actually it's not as uncommon as sometimes we think it is. And we also know that the severity of tics can reduce and in some people completely disappear by the age of 18. So it's really sort of specific to each person. So it's really easy to sort of think about the things that are just difficult for people with Tourette syndrome, but actually what we wanted to touch on here is what are strengths of people with Tourette syndrome. So it doesn't just give you tics. So we know that actually, whilst tics can be difficult, people with Tourette syndrome have many strengths. So for example, one of those is quick reaction times. So we know that that can make them good at certain sports and games or in school, quite strong in PE. We know that they're really good and really quick at learning new habits and skills. So you might notice that in particular lessons, or you might notice that they're a bit quicker than their peers. And finally, we know that they're really sensitive to the environment and others, which can make them a really, really great friend because they are so sensitive to others and what's going on around them. And it's also a really sort of helpful message, all of these strengths, to sort of pass on that message to people with Tourette syndrome or peers, to highlight some of those more positive sort of sides that we see. So it's just useful to be aware of some of the broader things which can make tics either worse or better. So we know that things like worry and stress can make tics worse and make the frequency increase. We also know some of those fundamental things, like if somebody is hungry, that actually this can make tics worse. We know that actually heightened emotions that aren't necessarily difficult emotions, things like feeling really excited, can make tics sort of increase. And again, just some of those real fundamental things there. We know that actually if your young person is really, really tired, that can make tics worse as well. And that's quite a common one that we see. We also know there are things that can make tics better. So we know exercise is a really helpful tool to make tics better. And sort of tied into that, or in different activities, distraction is really helpful. We know that distraction tends to reduce that tic severity. And again, linked in with that deep concentration. So anything that is making them really focus on something can really help to reduce tics. And then we've also got some sort of fundamental things there. Again, we know that if somebody with Tourette syndrome is having a good sleep routine, they're getting the sleep they need, that their tics tend to be better, and also having a sort of solid predictable routine can be really helpful. And just as we'd hope that everyone is kind to all the people around them, other people being kind to people with Tourette syndrome, we know has a positive effect on their tic severity.
Absolutely. Okay, so just to say a little bit about comorbidities. So we know that up to 85% of students with Tourette syndrome will have additional conditions alongside their tics, and often things, that we can't always see. So things such as autistic spectrum conditions, ADHD, and also mental health difficulties, so particularly anxiety and OCD, are amongst the most common. And we know that tics and Tourette syndrome can really impact a young person's self-esteem, and it can also lead to sort of difficult behaviours, ways that they can communicate this distress and what they're experiencing. We also know that they can be more easily distracted, so kind of find it more difficult to sort of pay attention, perhaps be a bit more fidgety or impulsive, and therefore find some tasks within school more difficult. But what we do know is that if others around them provide them with the understanding, that right support, that kindness that Anna just talked about, that they can reach their full potential. And we know that Tourette syndrome is not an indicator of low IQ or poor performance, it just needs to be supported. Okay, so what we know is that some people with Tourette syndrome, again, not all of them, can suppress their tics in school or in the classroom. And for some, they might be able to do this for a short time or quite a while, but it takes a lot of concentration. And this can be really, really uncomfortable for young people and often really tiring. And of course, because their attention is focused on sort of holding in and stopping those tics, that might make concentration and focus and engagement really difficult. And that can obviously cause extra difficulties for them in the classroom. So just a little exercise just to kind of illustrate how hard this can be for young people to do. So what we want you to do is just try and not blink for a whole minute. Okay, so if you start now, we'll keep the timer on. So really hold your eyes open and try not to blink, okay? I couldn't even do it for 10 seconds.
No, it's already gone.
So I guess, you know, for those of you that are still managing it, keep your eyes open there, but just sort of notice how uncomfortable this feels. And this is how some children describe how it feels to have to hold in a tic, okay? So just like blinking, even if they can hold in and stop the tics for a short while, this is incredibly uncomfortable. And just like we can't help blinking, they can't help doing the tics. Okay, and sometimes that pressure that young people feel to have to hold in the tics, maybe because they might be getting in trouble at school because of those things, or because they're being teased for them, can actually make them worse. So that pressure of I have to be able to do this can actually increase tics, because it increases that stress and anxiety. Okay, so we will come back to this when we think about what can we all do to help. But the most important sort of key message is we must never ask a person to stop ticking. Okay, so remember, they can't help it, and it will only make things worse for them. So in the same way we couldn't ever ask one another to stop blinking, we can't ever expect someone with Tourette syndrome to stop ticking. Okay, so that's the kind of first message. So here are kind of other key strategies for school staff. So Anna and I are going to talk through one at a time, just to kind of give you that kind of sense of why this is important and how we might execute some of these things. So first and foremost, education. Okay, education for yourself, for your colleagues, and for other students, and indeed parents as well, and young people. So it's important for everyone within the school environment to have knowledge of tics and Tourette syndrome. This will help reduce the anxiety of young people with Tourette syndrome and help to create more of that supportive network. And it will also reduce the likelihood of teasing and bullying, which we know can be really problematic for young people with tics. So they need that support, that understanding that education will bring. And as I said, Tourette's Action have some brilliant resources, and I'm going to signpost you to the kind of key page that they have around resources in school, and that includes assemblies that you can deliver to your school, in your school environment, to help sort of with that education.
We've also spoken about being mindful of the impact tics can have during sort of classroom activities. So we know that it's really important to be aware and mindful of the impact that tics can have on a young person's ability to engage in school and classroom activities. So we know that motor tics, or those movement tics of the head, neck or eyes, can really interfere with things like reading and writing. So just being aware that a young person with those tics might struggle to read or write for long periods of time is really helpful, and also knowing that both motor and vocal tics might make it difficult for a student to sort of read aloud, ask questions, or even ask for help if they need it. And we know, of course, there are other activities which might also be impacted by tics. And we know this can be really difficult for the young person and can lead to sort of maybe some difficult emotions or behaviours that you might see. So we know that therefore sort of being mindful of these and really getting to know your young person and exploring if they need some sort of reasonable adjustments alongside that can be really helpful in supporting them with that. So for example, maybe modifying tasks, you know, not marking down poor handwriting that we know is due to tics, or maybe considering other ways that students are recording their work, such as using a laptop or anything that is available to sort of help.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think this goes without saying, and something that you'll all be aware of, but the importance really of prioritizing our relationship with our young people and being kind and understanding. So this is really about getting to know them on a personal level and getting to know their tics as well on a personal level. It's about sort of naming with them that tics are okay to talk about, and I just want to understand so I can help you. So this is about exploring together, you know, what are the things that we could do to make those things more comfortable. As Anna talked about, it could be different tasks that young people find difficult depending on their tics. So asking them and exploring that together is kind of the key bit. And we need that relationship with them to be able to do that. And remember that there are those hidden tics that we can't always see, okay, or those ones that young people feel really embarrassed about, okay. So your relationship again is going to be key to help them open up, to help make sense of that together, and your kindness and understanding and really validating their experience will go an incredibly long way for them to be able to think about what could be most useful.
And I suppose this next one kind of goes without saying, but being really mindful of any teasing or bullying about tics. Now we know with tics and Tourette's that actually this can sometimes be a bit more subtle. So for example, we know that it's not uncommon for peers to sort of discover triggers which can cause tics and cause them to become worse and continue to sort of do these triggers or sort of have these triggers happen in front of that young person. And we know that tics are very suggestible, so this can be really distressing for that young person. So as you know, you all are already, you know, just being mindful of teasing or bullying, but also the different ways that that can occur for people with tics.
And again, your relationship with the young person will help them sort of communicate some of that stuff as well. Okay, so the next one, sort of try not to respond too much to tics. Okay, so what we kind of say is tics, not the young person, like attention. Okay, so the more attention we give them, the more they can increase. And then that can be sort of positive or negative attention. So sort of getting in trouble for them, as we talked about, can increase them because it draws attention to them. But likewise, lots of laughing about them can also sort of increase that attention and therefore tics. So it's really important that as much as possible, we try to just ignore the tics, not draw that attention to them. And it's really important when we're doing that education about tics and Tourette syndrome that we communicate the importance of this to other staff and students to kind of ensure that consistent approach. Because what we sometimes hear from students is that some teachers understand that and they don't draw attention, whereas other students in the same school, ever teach in the same school, may well accidentally draw attention, even if it comes from a meaningful sort of well felt place. You know, how can I help you, constantly drawing attention to them. And just to say along that line, we would never draw attention to the tics in a classroom environment or in front of peers, because again, that can really increase that anxiety and in turn the tics as well.
We've also spoken on here about setting sort of spaces to let out suppressed tics. So we know that for young people with tics, as Kelsey's already spoken about, that they're much more likely to suppress tics at school, and this can lead to increased tics and behaviours at home, because home is often that sort of safe place. So for young people who are sort of trying really hard to hold in those tics, which we know is really uncomfortable from that activity we just did, we know that it's quite likely that they can try really hard to suppress that at school, and then they get home and it can be a really difficult evening because there's sort of really intense tics. And of course that can actually make home life quite difficult, even with things like homework. You know, it's really difficult to do homework if you're having really severe tics all evening because you've been holding them in all day. So we sort of suggest that it can be really helpful to consider any sort of time out space, whether that's a private space during the school day, where that young person can sort of feel safe to let out those tics that they're suppressing, and stop that real build up from happening. And whether this is done via an exit card or scheduled brain breaks, as we like to call them, this can be quite helpful for that young person.
Absolutely. And as we've just said, it's very common for tic severity to vary between home and school. Often the pattern is that young people show less tics in school because they're highly motivated to hide them, okay, because of that kind of social pressure. So it's really not uncommon. And we also know that they can change in severity, as we talked about, that waxing and waning patterns of tics. So therefore, having sort of clear communication between home and school is obviously always key, but also key when we think about young people with Tourette syndrome and tics, just to kind of have that understanding about how the young person is coping sort of across both environments, and we can work together then with parents.
And also sort of quite practically, we've also popped on here about seating arrangements. So we know that seating arrangements for young people with tics are really important, because we want to try and avoid arrangements where tics are going to cause the greatest disruption, or more attention being given to them, which Kelsey's just spoken about. You know, for example, such as sitting in the middle of a row or perhaps near something breakable, with those sort of motor tics that we've spoken about. So sometimes being in the front actually can sort of improve attention for young people with tics, because we know that there's less distractions. But again, you know, for others with tics, this can also you know, make it worse because they feel that they're at the front and they're in that side of line of everyone. So I guess that's really going back to that point, that actually discussing with the young person again, you know, what they would feel would be the best sort of place for them to be sitting is really important. That, you know, that's going to be particular to each young person. However, generally what we find with young people with tics is that either being at the front or the middle of the class but to the side tends to work best. But we know this won't be the case for everyone. So again, just really encouraging that communication around that.
Absolutely. And then finally, considering exam arrangements. So of course we know that exams are stressful for most students, but this can be especially so for young people with Tourette syndrome and tics, because, you know, they're trying to then manage their tics in a really quiet environment, high stress environment, on top of all that additional exam stress that all students will be sort of facing, really. So it's really important to consider some of those sort of special, those practical arrangements, maybe such as providing a separate room or putting them in a smaller room if that's possible, and also perhaps allowing more time for rest or those brain breaks to release tics. So sometimes we've been able to speak to schools about sort of adding in those times in exams where young people are not in the exam, not doing it, but just having those scheduled times where they can let out their tics. So then it means that when they come back to the room, they can concentrate and focus better. It's also important to consider if a young person might need a reader or more times if the impact is if the tics are sort of impacting their reading and writing in any way. And just to say, we will be signposting you to a useful leaflet from Tourette's Action all about these exam arrangements, which we will include. It's just an important practical note to make. So in summary, we know that Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition which causes tics, which are movements or sounds that the person can't help doing. Okay, they're not doing them on purpose. And as we've said, that understanding, that education and kindness, and really the importance of our relationships with young people to allow that communication are really key. And there are specific strategies that we've talked through that schools can implement to really support young people. And again, this will be different for every young person, and that understanding, that kindness and that relationship are going to be key here. So really exploring with the student and their family what you can do to help them. So just finally, some key resources. So as I said, if you want to find out more, Tourette's Action is a great resource. We've sort of signposted to their kind of broader webpage there, but also to their specific support in school webpage. And that's where you'll find those two presentations, one for primary school age children, one for secondary school age children, which you can use to sort of educate classmates and peers. Key facts for teachers leaflet, again, it's just 2 pages, really, really quick. It sort of summarises lots of the things we've talked about today, as well as that other resource on exam access arrangements. As a team, we also have a parent carer workshop around understanding and supporting young people with tics, which is a useful one to share with parents that they can watch at any time. And then finally, we've put 2 key books there, which can be useful. A CBBC programme, again, all about a young person who experiences tics and Tourette syndrome. And finally, 2 podcasts, so different ways if you want to find out more. So I think all of that's left for us to say is thank you so much. We hope you've learned a lot about tics and Tourette syndrome, and hopefully it's built your confidence in knowledge and how to support young people in your school environment. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.